Well, that certainly sets the tone. Let's cross to London. And Ian Bond of the Centre for European Reform. David Cameron, one of his first interviews, quite clear, the renegotiation first, then the referendum before the end of 2017. But that renegotiation's already hitting hurdles, it seems.
Yes, it's very unclear at the moment exactly what David Cameron is going to ask for. And I think his ability to get something that he can present as a victory and then go through to a successful referendum depends on how realistic the questions are that he puts to his European colleagues.
Will he have more clout now that he is got a clear majority and is no longer in a coalition government?
Yes, without question, he will. He unexpectedly has come through to run a majority government, and that is going to strengthen his political standing. He can say to his European colleagues that this was the programme that he put forward to the British people, and the British people supported him.
At this point in time, how do you see this renegotiation going? You're saying it's unclear what he exactly can ask for. Can he get anything?
Yes, I think what was very interesting was that at the end of last week, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Ian Duncan Smith, who is seen as quite right-wing, focused in some comments that he made on the economic issues, on the competitiveness of the EU. And if David Cameron focuses on those sorts of issues, on how the EU can do better at promoting job creation and growth in European economies, then he'll probably find quite a lot of support around Europe. If he starts trying to undermine the fundamental principles, as Pierre Moscovici was saying, if he starts to go after the free movement of labour, then I think he's going to find it much harder to get any traction for that.
All right, so admitting he does get some concessions when it comes to competitiveness throughout the 28, how will then the electorate back home, and most notably the Tory backbenchers, react?
Well, that's an interesting question. There will be some people who I think would pretty much vote to leave the European Union regardless of what David Cameron brings back. There are others who would vote to stay in even if we didn't change anything in the European Union as a result of these negotiations. The question for Cameron is, what does he do with those in the middle? Those who are not entirely satisfied with the European Union as it is now, but equally can see the disadvantages of Britain being on the outside of the EU. And that includes a lot of people who listen attentively to business. Businesses in the UK, particularly those who are more export-oriented, are very worried about being left on the outside of the single market. So for them, there will be a very important calculation to make about whether to back any kind of result that David Cameron gets as being enough to justify recommending that their supporters, their constituents, vote to stay in.
All right, that's businesses, but we saw with the election result that Labour bled a lot of its support over to UKIP. So how will the rest of the electorate feel about it all?
It's quite interesting to see that the opinion polls that were being taken shortly before the election, and obviously given how inaccurate they were about the results of the election, one should treat this with caution. But they were showing that actually support for staying in the EU had increased. And in some ways that's natural, because a lot of the British hostility to the European Union is based on ignorance about what the EU actually is and does. And the more that it gets talked about, and the more that people understand the importance of the single market to the success of the British economy, the less likely they are to think it would be a really good idea to walk away from this.
So you say, but Ian Bond, in this country, we have an expression, the problem with a referendum is you don't know if the voters are going to answer the question they've been asked. How nervous are you at the prospect of a referendum?
Well, that's a good reason for not waiting until 2017. If I were David Cameron, I would definitely be saying to my backbenchers, you are keen on having a referendum, let's have that referendum as soon as we can. It will reduce the level of uncertainty for business, but it will also reduce the risk that, as you say, people answer the wrong question. And if you leave it until 2 years into the government, when no doubt they will have had to take some very unpopular decisions, making further cuts to public services in order to meet their deficit reduction targets, then at that point people are more likely to punish the government for reasons that have nothing to do with whether or not they've negotiated a good deal with Europe. So if I were David Cameron, I would be looking to do a deal quite quickly. And that also avoids the risk that it gets entangled with the French and German election campaigns in 2017, when, again, he might find that it's more difficult for other European leaders to make concessions to him if that doesn't play well in their own election campaigns.
Ian, on Sunday, one influential MP, Graham Brady, urged Cameron to allow Eurosceptic ministers to campaign for Britain leaving the EU in order to avoid, as he put it, the appearance of a rancorous split. Will the Conservative Party be bruised by the referendum?
As I said, I think that depends on the kind of deal that he gets. There are some people who will vote against whatever happens. I'm not sure that it's possible to keep those people within a government if the Prime Minister comes back and says, I have achieved a good deal for Britain, I am going to recommend that people vote in favour of staying in. If you're a member of the Prime Minister's cabinet, it's pretty difficult in those circumstances to say, in effect, well, Prime Minister, thanks very much, but I don't think you've got a good deal for Britain. So I think you can imagine a significant backbench revolt. You can imagine that some members of the cabinet might feel that they would have to leave the cabinet in those circumstances. But I think the majority of them will wait to see and will stick with the Prime Minister if they can. And after all, the history for the Conservatives of splits over Europe is that it's one of the things that led to their loss of the public view of them as the competent party in the early 1990s. And that resulted in them being in the wilderness from 1997 until 2010.
So will we see, I guess everyone's wondering, the same kind of split take place like we saw under John Major? Or are we headed for a long period where we'll have Conservatives controlling England and the SNP controlling Scotland?
Well, that question about Scotland is a very interesting one. The Scottish National Party have already suggested that if, as it were, England voted to leave the EU, and given the size of England in comparison with the other parts of the United Kingdom, that would probably carry the day. But if England voted to leave the EU and Scotland voted to stay in, then they have suggested that that might justify another referendum on Scottish independence. And I think that will be another factor for Conservative MPs. They are the Conservative and Unionist Party officially, and it would be quite hard for them, I think, to preside over a referendum campaign recommending a course of action which they knew might lead to a further Scottish referendum and to Scottish independence. So that may also keep some Conservative MPs from voting against whatever deal the Prime Minister brings back.
All right, uncertainty concentrating the minds in the end, predicts Ian Bond. Ian Bond of the Centre for European Reform, many thanks for joining us from London.
Thank you.